Pacific Theater, summer 1944. The jungle is quiet in a way that feels unnatural. No gunfire, no artillery, only the sound of insects and distant surf rolling against a coral shoreline. Canvas tents stand in a clearing carved from the green. Their white fabric glows faintly under the tropical sun. Inside, men lie on stretchers, bandaged, pale, breathing. Some are missing limbs, others are burned. Many should already be dead. But they are not. The air carries a sharp, unfamiliar scent. Antiseptic, alcohol, clean water. It cuts through the rot and dampness that define the Pacific battlefield. A small group of Japanese soldiers watches from the tree line. Some are wounded prisoners. Others are scouts, brought here after the fighting has moved on. They look on in silence as American medics move with urgency, but without panic. Plasma bottles hang from improvised stands. Surgical tools gleam. A generator hums steadily in the background. One wounded Marine convulses, then steadies. His pulse returns. For the observers, this is not just strange, it is incomprehensible. In their experience, a wound like that is a death sentence. Here, it is treated as a problem to be solved. And in that moment, amid the heat and flies of a captured island, something shifts, not in firepower, but in understanding. Because this battlefield is not about who can kill more men. It is about who can bring them back. The medical reality of the Pacific War. When the Pacific War erupted in December 1941, it unfolded across distances unlike any other theater of the Second World War. Vast oceans, isolated islands, jungle interiors that swallowed men whole. Supply lines stretched thousands of miles, often ending on beaches with no ports, no roads, and no infrastructure of any kind. For every soldier killed by bullets or artillery, another was threatened by something less visible: malaria, dysentery, dengue fever, fungal infections, heat stroke, untreated wounds that festered in humidity and filth. From the very beginning, the Pacific War was a test not just of weapons, but of endurance. The Imperial Japanese Army entered the war with a medical system shaped by different assumptions. Its doctrine emphasized speed, sacrifice, and the offensive spirit. Medical support existed, but it was limited by logistics, doctrine, and a deeply ingrained cultural belief that severe wounds were often a soldier's final contribution. Evacuation from the front was rare. Jungle campaigns made organized treatment nearly impossible. Many Japanese units relied on basic first aid, herbal remedies, and minimal surgical intervention performed under extreme conditions. A gravely wounded soldier was frequently left behind, not out of cruelty, but necessity. Across the ocean, the United States approached the problem from a fundamentally different angle. The U.S. Army entered World War II, having already absorbed the painful lessons of the First World War. In 1918, more American soldiers had died from disease than enemy fire. That reality drove a quiet but determined transformation in military medicine during the interwar years. By 1941, the U.S. Army Medical Department had expanded dramatically. It trained thousands of doctors, nurses, corpsmen, and specialists before the first shots were fired in the Pacific. Medical planning was embedded into operational planning. Casualty estimates were calculated not just to measure losses, but to anticipate how many men could be saved. This difference mattered immediately. In early Pacific campaigns, Wake Island, the Philippines, Malaya, Japanese forces advanced rapidly, often overwhelming Allied defenders, but as the war shifted from movement to attrition, the environment began to punish everyone equally. On Guadalcanal in 1942, disease crippled both sides. Malaria alone incapacitated entire battalions. Yet outcomes diverged. American units, though battered, began rotating sick and wounded men off the island. Hospital ships waited offshore. Field hospitals expanded behind the lines. Men returned to duty after weeks, sometimes months. Japanese units did not rotate. They endured. As supply lines collapsed and starvation spread, medical care deteriorated further. Japanese medical officers documented cases of soldiers dying from wounds that in other circumstances might have been survivable. Amputations were rare. Blood transfusions were nearly non-existent. Antibiotics were unavailable in meaningful quantities. Survival was not expected. This disparity was not yet fully understood by those fighting on either side. At this stage of the war, most Japanese soldiers had never seen an American field hospital. Most Americans had never encountered the full consequences of fighting an enemy who expected death rather than recovery. But the gap was widening, and as the war pushed deeper into the Central and Southwest Pacific, the difference between the two systems would soon be visible, not in reports or doctrine, but in living, breathing men who should not have survived. That realization would come only after contact. America's quiet medical revolution. By the time the Pacific War reached its second year, the United States was fighting on an industrial scale unmatched by any power in history. Ships, aircraft, ammunition, and fuel flowed westward across the ocean in endless convoys. Less visible, but just as deliberate, was another supply chain moving alongside them: medicine. The U.S. Army did not treat battlefield medicine as an afterthought. It treated it as a system. Every landing plan, every offensive timetable, every projected casualty figure included a medical equation: how many would fall, how quickly they could be treated, and how many could be returned to life, or at least spared from death. At the front line, the system began with the combat medic or Navy corpsman. Often under fire, they carried morphine syrettes, bandages, plasma kits, and sulfa powder. Bleeding was stopped quickly, shock was treated immediately. Time, measured in minutes, was understood as the difference between survival and loss. From there, the wounded moved backward through a carefully layered chain. Battalion aid stations sat just behind the fighting. Field ambulances, jeeps, tracked vehicles, even stretchers carried by hand, moved men to clearing stations. Further back, field hospitals rose almost overnight. Canvas tents unfolded into operating theaters, portable generators powered lights and sterilization equipment. Water purification units ensured surgeons could wash their hands in conditions that would have horrified doctors a generation earlier. Blood plasma changed everything. Unlike whole blood, plasma could be dried, shipped, and reconstituted near the front. Shock, once a near-certain killer, became manageable. A soldier with catastrophic blood loss now had a chance. By 1944, American medics were administering thousands of plasma transfusions across the Pacific. Then came antibiotics. Sulfa drugs were already in widespread use early in the war, dramatically reducing infection rates. Penicillin, though still scarce in 1943, began appearing in frontline hospitals by 1944. Wounds that would once have turned gangrenous were cleaned, treated, and closed. Amputations, while still common, became controlled procedures rather than desperate last measures. Just as important as the tools was the philosophy. American doctrine rejected the idea that a wounded soldier was a lost soldier. Survival itself became a form of strength. Every man saved was one less replacement to train, transport, and integrate. Every survivor reinforced morale, proof that injury did not mean abandonment. This system extended beyond the battlefield. Hospital ships, clearly marked and protected by international law, waited offshore during major landings. Air evacuation transformed timelines. In some cases, wounded men were transported hundreds of miles within hours. By the later stages of the war, a Marine wounded on an island could be receiving advanced surgery in Hawaii within days. Survival rates reflected this transformation. Compared to earlier wars, American wounded were surviving at unprecedented levels. The percentage of soldiers who died from wounds after reaching medical care dropped dramatically. What had once been fatal became treatable. What had once ended a life became a recovery. It was this reality, quiet, methodical, relentlessly practiced, that Japanese soldiers would encounter in fragments at first: a captured aid station, a wounded prisoner who did not die, a report from a medical officer describing enemy facilities that seemed impossibly well equipped. At first, these accounts were dismissed as exaggeration, but as the fighting intensified and contact became unavoidable, disbelief gave way to something far more unsettling. Because the enemy, it seemed, was not just winning battles, he was saving his men.
Survival, systems, and the shock of comparison. On the American side of the line, survival began to reshape the emotional landscape of the war. Men who would once have been written off were instead stabilized, evacuated, and returned, sometimes scarred, sometimes broken, but alive. A Marine with a shattered leg could expect morphine within minutes. A soldier bleeding out from shrapnel wounds might feel the cool relief of plasma entering his veins before shock took hold. These experiences spread through units. Stories circulated of men surviving injuries that, by any previous standard, were fatal. The knowledge mattered. It steadied nerves. It reinforced the belief that the system would not abandon them. For Japanese soldiers, the idea was alien. Imperial Army doctrine did not prepare men for recovery from severe wounds. Medical training focused on basic first aid, sanitation, and endurance. The assumption, often unspoken, was that serious injury marked the end of usefulness. Many Japanese soldiers carried cyanide or were instructed not to burden their unit if mortally wounded. When Japanese troops first encountered American wounded who lived, the reaction was not envy, it was disbelief. Interrogation reports from later in the war record repeated expressions of shock from captured Japanese soldiers. Men described seeing Americans with amputated limbs still breathing. Others noted soldiers heavily bandaged, sedated, and stable, conditions they had never witnessed under fire. Life, extended beyond expectation, became a psychological shockwave. Beyond compassion, battlefield medicine served a tactical function. Units that could treat and evacuate their wounded retained combat effectiveness longer. Fewer replacements were needed. Veterans returned with experience intact. American commanders understood this. Medical officers were integrated into planning staffs. Landing zones were selected not only for fire support, but for access routes to hospitals. Timelines accounted for casualty flow. Japanese units, by contrast, were designed for decisive engagements. Once cut off, they deteriorated rapidly. Wounded men drained manpower and supplies. Without evacuation, injuries became liabilities. Over time, this imbalance shaped outcomes. Battles became wars of exhaustion. One side recovered, the other did not. What stunned Japanese observers most was not the presence of doctors, but the equipment. Portable X-ray machines appeared in some field hospitals. Sterilization units produced clean instruments in places where Japanese surgeons struggled to boil water. Electric lighting allowed operations at night. Refrigeration preserved medicines. These were not luxuries, they were force multipliers. Captured documents reveal Japanese officers describing American medical sites as factories for restoration. The phrase was not praise, it was a recognition of scale. And with each captured hospital, each wounded prisoner who survived, the pattern became harder to deny. Because this was not chance, it was design. And design, once recognized, demands explanation. Perception, leadership, and moral distance. For the average Japanese infantryman, war was defined by scarcity. Food ran short, ammunition was rationed, medical supplies, when they existed at all, were quickly exhausted. In the jungles of New Guinea or the caves of Saipan, wounds were cleaned with water, if water could be found. Bandages were reused. Pain was endured in silence. Then came capture.
Japanese prisoners who passed through American medical stations experienced something that contradicted everything they had been taught. They were treated. Their wounds were cleaned. Some received surgery. Others were given food and rest. Post-war testimonies record the same moment again and again. Confusion followed by shame. Shame not at being treated, but at realizing that survival had been possible all along. One former Japanese medical orderly later described seeing American doctors work through the night on wounded enemy prisoners. The concept unsettled him more than the defeat itself. This was not mercy as weakness, it was systematized care. By 1944, Japanese commanders were no longer dismissing reports of American medical capacity. Intelligence summaries noted unusually high U.S. casualty survival rates. Analysts struggled to reconcile battlefield losses with sustained offensive pressure. The conclusion was grim. American forces could absorb punishment and continue advancing. Losses that would cripple Japanese units barely slowed their enemy. Medical resilience translated directly into operational momentum. Some Japanese officers recognized the implication too late. Without the industrial base to replicate such systems, the gap could not be closed. Medicine, like air power and logistics, had become an arena of dominance. Underlying everything was a philosophical difference. American military culture treated the wounded as individuals worth saving. Japanese doctrine emphasized collective endurance and honorable death. Neither approach was accidental. Each reflected national values, industrial realities, and historical experience. But in modern industrial war, the consequences were uneven. As battles grew longer and bloodier, the side that preserved life gained more than soldiers. It gained time. It gained confidence. It gained inevitability. For Japanese soldiers watching American wounded survive in clean tents under electric lights, the realization was slow and devastating. They were not just facing superior firepower. They were facing a system designed to outlast them. And that understanding would crystallize fully during the war's most brutal battles, when survival itself became evidence.
When observation became certainty. The turning point did not arrive in a single battle or a single moment. It emerged gradually across islands where the fighting was so intense that the dead could not be buried and the wounded could not be hidden. Saipan, June 1944. The island became a crucible. American forces landed with overwhelming naval and air support, but once inland, the fighting collapsed into caves, ravines, and close-range combat. Casualties mounted rapidly on both sides. For the Japanese defenders, evacuation was impossible. Medical stations were buried deep underground, poorly supplied, and overwhelmed within days. For the Americans, the system activated. Behind the beaches, field hospitals expanded continuously, tents multiplied, surgical teams rotated without pause. Plasma was administered in quantities that would have been unimaginable 2 years earlier. Men with abdominal wounds, once almost always fatal, were stabilized and operated on within hours. Japanese soldiers captured during the battle began arriving at these facilities. They expected interrogation. Some expected execution. Instead, they were triaged. Wounds were examined without hesitation. Shrapnel was removed. Fluids were administered. Pain was treated. The process was indifferent to nationality. Severity determined priority. Several Japanese prisoners later recalled seeing rows of American wounded, many gravely injured, still alive days after being hit. Limbs amputated cleanly, infections controlled, men conscious, speaking, waiting. For seasoned Japanese troops, this was the moment disbelief hardened into certainty. On Leyte later that year, the pattern repeated. The battles stretched across months of rain, mud, and relentless combat.
Japanese casualties skyrocketed, not only from enemy fire, but from disease and starvation. American losses were heavy, but evacuation never ceased. Aircraft lifted wounded off jungle airstrips. Hospital ships received them offshore in numbers previously unseen in the Pacific. Japanese reconnaissance units reported American medical installations operating continuously, even under threat of artillery. Destroying them proved difficult. They were mobile, redundant, quickly replaced. On Okinawa in 1945, the contrast reached its most brutal expression. The battle produced more casualties than any other Pacific campaign, tens of thousands wounded, yet American medical survival rates continued to improve. More men lived than died after reaching care. Penicillin was now widely available. Surgical teams refined techniques under fire. Japanese defenders, trapped in caves with dwindling supplies, watched enemy wounded disappear and sometimes reappear weeks later, alive. At this point, the implication was unavoidable. American strength did not lie solely in firepower or numbers. It lay in the ability to turn catastrophic injury into temporary absence. To wound an American soldier was no longer enough. He might return. And that realization, forged in blood and antiseptic, marked the psychological turning point, when battlefield medicine revealed itself as a decisive force.
The realization that changed the war's meaning. By the final year of the Pacific War, the evidence was no longer anecdotal. It was statistical, it was documented, and it was deeply unsettling to those who read it. Japanese intelligence officers compiling post-action reports faced a contradiction they could not resolve. American units continued offensive operations, despite casualty figures that, by Japanese standards, should have rendered them combat ineffective. Entire battalions took losses that would have destroyed imperial formations, yet the advance continued. The missing variable was not replacements, it was survival. Captured documents in post-war interrogations reveal a growing awareness among Japanese officers that American wounded were not being lost at expected rates. One intelligence summary noted that U.S. forces maintained strength despite severe injury ratios, a carefully worded admission that death was no longer the automatic outcome of being wounded. Prisoners of war became living proof. Japanese soldiers taken during the later campaigns often arrived in American custody with serious injuries. Many expected their condition to worsen. Instead, they stabilized, they healed. Some survived wounds they themselves believed fatal. The experience forced an internal reckoning. If the enemy could save his men at this scale, then attrition, the strategy Japan increasingly relied upon, was no longer viable. This realization spread unevenly, filtered through censorship and battlefield isolation. But among those who saw American medical systems firsthand, the conclusion was unavoidable. The United States had transformed survival into a weapon. Not in speeches, not in propaganda, but in practice. A wounded American soldier no longer represented a loss. He represented delay, temporary absence, statistical noise in a system designed to compensate. For Japanese troops raised on the belief that injury equaled sacrifice, this was psychologically corrosive. It reframed the meaning of endurance. It suggested that suffering was not inevitable, that it had been shaped by choices, resources, and doctrine. By Okinawa, the final and bloodiest campaign, the contrast reached its breaking point. Japanese medical services collapsed entirely under the weight of casualties and shortages. American medical networks expanded even as shells fell nearby. Casualty clearing stations operated underground. Hospital ships rotated constantly. Air evacuation ran day and night. Men lived who should not have lived, and in the cold arithmetic of modern war, that fact carried strategic weight. Because victory was no longer determined solely by who could inflict losses fastest, it was determined by who could absorb them and keep going. And that truth, once understood, cast a long shadow over everything that followed. The consequences of survival. When the fighting ended, the difference in outcomes was stark, not just in territory gained or lost,
but in bodies counted, lives preserved, and futures altered. American casualty statistics from the Pacific War revealed something unprecedented. Of those wounded in action who reached medical care, a historically high percentage survived. Compared to previous conflicts, the fatality rate among the wounded had dropped dramatically. In earlier wars, infection, shock, and delayed treatment had killed men long after the shooting stopped. In the Pacific, those killers were steadily pushed back. This had immediate strategic consequences. Units remained operational longer. Veterans with combat experience were rotated back into service instead of being replaced by untested recruits. Morale remained higher than casualty numbers alone would suggest. Soldiers fought with the knowledge, sometimes unspoken, that survival was possible even after catastrophe. For Japanese forces, the aftermath told a different story. By the final campaigns, medical collapse had become total. Starvation weakened immune systems, untreated wounds turned fatal, diseases spread unchecked. Japanese casualty figures reflected not only battlefield losses, but systemic failure to preserve life. Post-war analysis by Allied medical officers concluded that a significant portion of Japanese battlefield deaths resulted from wounds that would likely have been survivable under American medical care. The observation was clinical, not judgmental, but the implication was profound. Medicine had shaped the outcome of the war as surely as aircraft carriers and artillery. For surviving Japanese soldiers and medics, this realization lingered long after surrender. Many described the shock of captivity not in terms of defeat, but of treatment. Being healed by the enemy challenged years of indoctrination. It forced a reconsideration of what modern warfare demanded and what it could allow. American military planners took note as well. The Pacific experience validated decades of investment in medical logistics, research, and doctrine. Field hospitals, evacuation chains, blood programs, and antibiotics were no longer auxiliary services. They were core components of combat power. This understanding would shape every future conflict. But the full impact of what had been witnessed and learned would only emerge in the years that followed, when the war ended and its lessons were examined in silence. What the war left behind. In the years after 1945, the Pacific War was dissected in reports, testimonies, and medical journals. Generals analyzed campaigns. Engineers studied logistics. Doctors reviewed survival data with a different kind of gravity, because behind every statistic was a human life that had nearly ended. One conclusion emerged consistently: battlefield medicine had crossed a threshold. The U.S. Army Medical Department formally recorded that survival rates among wounded personnel had surpassed anything previously achieved in war. The combination of rapid evacuation, blood plasma, antibiotics, and trained medical teams had transformed the meaning of injury. Wounds no longer marked the end of participation in war or life itself. Other nations took notice. Post-war Japanese military and medical reform placed far greater emphasis on evacuation, sanitation, and modern treatment. Former Imperial Army doctors, reflecting on their wartime experiences, acknowledged that resource limitations and doctrine had cost lives unnecessarily. The lesson was painful, but unmistakable. Civilian medicine benefited as well. Techniques refined in Pacific field hospitals, trauma surgery, shock treatment, infection control, filtered into post-war hospitals around the world. The war accelerated practices that would save countless lives in peacetime. Yet, for many Japanese veterans, the memory remained personal. They remembered American hospitals not as places of humiliation, but of contradiction. The enemy who destroyed their units also healed their bodies. The experience complicated narratives of hatred and honor. It introduced doubt into a worldview built on absolutes. For Americans, the lesson was quieter but equally lasting. Saving lives became part of how the military measured success. Medical units gained institutional respect. Research funding expanded. The idea that survival could be engineered, planned for, resourced, and executed became doctrine. By the time the Cold War began, the battlefield had changed forever. Weapons would grow more destructive, but medicine would keep pace. And the silent revolution that unfolded in jungle clearings and canvas tents across the Pacific would shape every war that followed. All that remained was to understand what it truly meant.
The hidden weapon of survival. War is often measured in firepower, territory, and numbers, yet in the Pacific, a quieter force proved decisive: the ability to save life. American field hospitals, with their tents, plasma, antibiotics, and relentless order, transformed the meaning of injury. What once ended a man's service now became temporary absence. Wounded soldiers returned to the fight. Units endured. Battles stretched longer, but the enemy could no longer rely on attrition alone. For Japanese soldiers, the experience was bewildering. Their culture and doctrine had taught that death and suffering were inevitable companions of combat. To see wounded men survive, healed by the enemy, challenged not just expectations, but belief itself. It forced a reckoning. Survival could be designed, not random. Life could be a tool, not merely a consequence. In the aftermath, this lesson rippled far beyond the Pacific Islands. Modern military medicine, trauma surgery, and evacuation protocols all trace roots to those jungle hospitals. Survival rates reshaped strategy, morale, and the ethics of warfare. The war's brutality remained undeniable, but amid the smoke, blood, and chaos, another story emerged. A story of life preserved against the odds, and of humanity harnessed as a weapon. In that tension between destruction and care, the Pacific War revealed one of its most enduring truths. Victory is not only about who can kill more, but who can save and sustain more. History remembers the battles, but the living remember what it meant to survive.